A very warm welcome to you, to the university. My name is Rob Duck. I'm the Dean of the School of the Environment, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to this winter lecture of 2013. We've got three speakers for you this afternoon, and in seamless transition they're going to talk to you about shaping the natural and built environment. Dundee, a city in transformation. You all know the city, and you know it's changing, and it's changing very, very quickly indeed. Welcome to those of you here from the Harris, from Craigie, from Dundee High School, and from St Paul's, all from different parts of the city, but everyone who knows this city really, really well. What we're going to do, we're going to look back though, we're going to look back at the foundations of the city, how it has come to be. We're then going to look at what's going on today, the things that you see going on around you. And it's not just things coming down, there are going to be things going up as well. And then we ought to look with a lens to the future. What's going to happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years' time? You're going to hear from three professors, John Round, Graham Hutton and Deborah Peel, in that order. They're each going to talk to you for about 15 minutes. And after the lecture, you're going to get an opportunity to talk to them, to talk to their colleagues, to look at some of the displays that we've got outside, to ask any questions that you might have, and pick up various pieces of information about our School of the Environment here in Dundee. So welcome to this Christmas lecture. I'm now going to hand over, first of all, to John Rowan to kick off. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon everybody. We're going to take you through a little journey that looks at the history of Dundee, past, present and future. It's basically a story that we divide into three sections. Something about the geographical context, it speaks to the geography programme within the school. Something about the contemporary activity within the city in terms of urbanisation. Something about the way that the city looks and has been developed. Relation to architecture, and then looking forwards about this whole idea of transformation, how Dundee's changing its position in the world and looking to the outside world and trying to come up with a new brand, and we think about the ways in which the city interacts with the world, and that says something about planning and the city and the city region. So just a couple of numbers to keep in mind that help us understand the way that the city's changed over time. Very importantly, it's located on the mouth of the River Tay and the Tay estuary, Scotland's fourth largest city. The population, as observed and reported in 2012, was about 150,000, so it's quite a large urban centre. Has a long occupation history. Those of you who know the law behind us will know that it has the foundations of an Iron Age hill fort, but it's had a much longer history of occupation, some of which we'll see over the course of this talk. It was formed as a royal borough back in 1190, and the city covers an area of 6,500 hectares, and a hectare is about the size of a football pitch or a rugby pitch, so it kind of gives you some sense of the extent of the footprint of the city. We're going to think a little bit about the footprint of the city, how it's changed over time, and the way it interacts with the world around it. Initially quite locally, but increasingly in a global context. And hopefully therefore you see the relevance of geography, of architecture and planning, and how they work together within our so-called School of the Environment here at the University of Dundee. And the other thing that's not mentioned on this slide is that we're at a critical moment in the history of the city. Currently at the moment there's a development programme. Those of you who know the downtown, will see some images later, know that we've got a £1 billion plus programme of redevelopment. So how does that play out in the future? Perhaps to understand that better, we could maybe look a little bit into the past. And when I say looking a little bit into the past, let's look quite far into the past to understand the position of Dundee. So when we go back 400 million years, it's quite a long time, go back 400 million years, we see that Scotland didn't exist as a single landmass. Instead, it existed as a series of little blocks out in the proto-North Atlantic, as these little blocks of crust which over time come together and weld together to create the Scottish landmass. And interestingly, when we look at this diagram here, we've got this northern continent This is North America. These little globs floating here are bits of Scotland. We've got this thing called the Iapetus Ocean. And to the south we've got Southern Ireland, England and Wales, Scandinavia, and we see these two bits of crust coming together. And as they come together over time, this is a period of tremendous geological activity. There's earthquakes, there's volcanoes, the closure of this ocean, phases of mountain building and so on, is a very, very dynamic period of time. But the consequences to produce from these drifting blocks this landmass, which we know is Scotland, and you can see some of these big fault lines located on the map here, which tell us how these different bits of block were brought together. They're called terrains, and you may have talked about that sort of thing in some of your geography classes. And then when we look at the consequence of that, we see the Scottish landmass here picked out by these different geological sequences, these different rock types. And just purely visually, you can see that there's a very strong association between the underlying geology that we see here and the land surface as shown by this satellite image. And so we can see the highlands picked out over here. I'm getting my little pen to work. There's a laser, which is the thing to do. Here are these ancient highland rocks, metamorphic in nature. But we're really interested in this part of the Scottish landmass in here, the so-called Central Valley, south of the Highland Boundary Fault and north of the Southern Upland Fault. And in particular, we're going to zoom in this little section here, which we can look at this slightly more complicated, actually quite an old but famous geological map. And here we are here in the city of Dundee. Here we've got us located on the mouth of the River Tay. It's quite important in terms of economic history of the city. We can see to the north we've got these yellow rocks on this map, and that's north of the Highland Boundary Fault. These are ancient, hard, crystalline rocks producing this Highland Scottish Massif. We've got this map dominated by this orange lithology, this orange rock, and that's sedimentary sandstone rocks. We've got these things here. I used to talk to my students in first year. I kind of describe this as a lobster claw. It looks like that. I don't know if you can see that structure yourself. To my mind, it's very, very obvious, but there's a big series of purple rock here and here, some brown stuff, and then these red blobs. So these are different types of rock, but the importance of the different types of rock is they've got different physical properties, different strengths in particular, and over millennia, as we've had a succession of geological phases and a succession of ice passages across the landscape, so it sculpts out the shape of the landscape within which we live, and there's very particular character that you can see. So more familiarly, this is a Google image. You can see this high rock north of the Highland Boundary Fault. We can see this large area here, this valley, which is Strathmore, which is made up of these sedimentary rocks, these sandstones, for example. Then we've got two smaller hill ranges, to the north, the Sidlaws, to the south of the Tay, the Ochils, and then we've got a large area to the west of the city called the Carsagowrie, which is this rolling flatland. So these different terrains, which reflect the underlying geology, have developed upon them a series of different soil types, and the question is, how has society interacted with this physical structure, partly to explain the way that Dundee has developed over time. So we can look at the relationship between climate, between topography, and we can think about the ways in which the city has interacted with its local environment and indeed transformed it to say something about the way the city itself has developed. And we can see Dundee's emergence as a trading centre reflects this set of resources that are situated around the city itself. So to the north we've got, this is Glen Clover. You can see these hard, ancient crystalline rocks to the north of the Highland Boundary Fault. You can see the rolling heather-covered hills of the Sidlaws. On this sort of terrain, you don't necessarily grow crops, but you grow cattle or you grow sheep, and they become an important part of the agricultural produce of the area. As we move down in the landscape, we've got the large flatlands of Strathmore, and here we've got very significant amounts of cereal production, potatoes, wheat, barley, the classic grain basket of Scotland, things like oilseed rape. Historically, flax was important, hemp was important, and they set in place a tradition of textile working in this part of the world. It's picked up by trade with the Low Countries, and that sets the foundation for Dundee's very famous jute industry, as we'll briefly touch upon. The Castle Gowrie is this other area to the west of the city, which is in fact, was once upon a time underneath the sea, but as the land recovered after the last ice age, and the last of the ice retreated, the landmass bounced up, rebounded through this process of isostatic uplift. And we've got these very, very productive coastal lowlands, which again are very important for cereal production, but also for potatoes, and again, one of the kind of indicative crops of the region, soft fruits, raspberries and strawberries. Very, very popular in this part of the world, great climate, great soils, and that basically produces the tradition of jam making in the region. So just to cap in terms of agricultural transformation, the steeper, cooler, wetter parts of the landscape produce livestock. The lower, drier, warmer parts of the landscape produce soft fruits, produce cereal crops, and from those cereal crops we get a tradition of textile manufacture. And it's not a million miles to go from weaving linen from flax to weaving jute into sandbags and baskets. And similarly, in terms of this long-standing tradition of producing soft fruits, those have kind of morphed into Dundee's tradition in terms of things like marmalade and jam, which are one of the 3 J's of Dundee: jute, jam, journalism being the third. Just to show you that environmental resources are a daily part of our lives, but also help us understand the nature of the city, past, present, and indeed future, we can look at the relationship of the city to the environmental resources in terms of the geological resources. So the sedimentary rocks we talked about, all these sandstones, are very important in terms of producing what's called dimension stone, blocks from which you can build tenements. The volcanic rocks, these blobs we saw on the geological map of Tayside, produce very hard rocks, which are very good for making road stones, and there's several quarries in the law which were used back in the day for building road stones. Those quaternary deposits we saw to the west of the city produce a clay which is good for brick making, and indeed if we dredge sand out of the contemporary river, then that's used in every single SPL football pitch in Scotland. It's particularly famous because it's rolled beautifully by the 2 tides of the day, and it produces a nice round sand, then dressed it on the football pitch, so are expensive. Footballers don't get a grazed knee if they do a sliding tackle. And just to give you that by way of example, these are those sandstones that have been transformed into the building blocks of the city from which the urban fabric of the city is being produced. And Dundee is an amazing place. Again, just thinking briefly about its relationship with its environmental resources. This is a picture of medieval Dundee from 1693. And the population used to bump along down here in the tens of thousands. But with the Industrial Revolution, we see this incredible explosion of population and this attention that moves away from working on things like hemp and linen and moving into manufacturing of jute. That draws with it tremendous industrial possibilities, tremendous growth in the population, explosion in terms of the economy of the city, and we see this very, very dense industrial city emerging in the landscape. And that's just an example of some of the kind of configurations that we would see back as the city went through this period of industrialisation. And just similarly looking and thinking about how the city grew up, the way it grew up itself, the morphology of the city as we talk about, was itself conditioned by the relationship between natural resources. And if we think about one of the most important things for a growing population and a growing industrial base is the need for water. And if we look at the city, this is a rather grotty looking image, but it serves my purpose as well because we can draw on it the picture of some rivers that flow through the landscape, the cityscape. We've got the Scouring Burn, we've got the Dens Burn, and we've got the Dixty Water. And you might know the location of these burns, but now they don't exist because they've been put underground. They were being culverted underground to supply the power and the disposal water for the jute industry. And if we map out on the city where the jute mills are, these big factories which were producing the jute textile, we see a very close association in terms of where they're located relative to access to water. So throughout the history of the city, we see this relationship between the way that things develop and access to resources. And I think that's quite a kind of powerful image. Some of you, if you were to come to the University of Dundee, might take up a hall of residence. We see many of these big 19th century jute mills, which are no longer used to produce jute, become residential properties, trendy flats where students live. But we've got Lockheed, the Dens Road, and down here in the Brown Street Mill Complex. It's a very, very striking example of the relationship between space and resource and the city. And just briefly, final two slides from me was to think about the nature of the relationship with the city and the wider world and the wider resource base. So just to go back to the fact that Dundee's sited on the river. So it has access to the lowlands of Northern Europe, but it also has access to the wider world through shipping channels. And Dundee had a very famous, you might not know about it, but it was once upon a time a very thriving shipbuilding industry. And part of that was linked to a very strong tradition of whaling. So there was whaling up in the North Atlantic. We built the ships like Discovery, which is in the harbour down here. So there was traditionally access to the agricultural hinterland for agricultural products and timber. Then this expansion to trade more widely across Europe to get flax, and then increasingly internationally to get jute that powered the jute revolution in the city of Dundee itself. And just by way of a coincidence of resource, the whale oil that the whalers searched for was the breakthrough that was able to make jute, which is a textile that comes from India. It's quite a brittle thing when you dry it out, but if you apply a whale oil to it, it becomes a bit softer. You can batch it, it's called, and you can condition it in such a way that you can spin it, and you can make yarn from it, and you can make sailcloth and sacks. So that was a very important thing that made Dundee the most important jute town in the entire world. And so my final slide is just to think about that notion of the changing relations of the city. From the 1830s, when we see that massive expansion of population, jute becomes the key import. This concentration made Dundee world famous. That unprecedented population growth had a very strong demand on local resources and a major environmental impact. But as the jute became increasingly important and came from the Indian subcontinent, as technology transfer moved such that people in the Indian cities were able to produce jute for themselves, so Dundee goes into a pretty terrible period of post-industrial decline. And on that bombshell, we're going to finish Act 1, and I'm going to hand you to Graham for Act 2 as well.
Okay, Act 2. John has largely been talking about this figured edge and actually the relationship between the water's edge and its importance as a port for the city of Dundee. Now, we're interested in this red area. The red area is actually reclaimed land, post-railways and so on, and the demise of the importance of the port. The city reclaimed much of the land that we're going to talk about today. So we are interested in this area here. This might be a slide that you're familiar with. This is the city's master plan for the waterfront. Now, just to locate you for a little bit, there's the Caird Hall. That's Caird Square in there. McDonald's is there. So there's a proposal for a grand public space here and a series of urban blocks, what we call a block plan. Here, here, and here. There's the Tay Road Bridge coming in. A block here, which is going to be slightly more difficult. And at the time that this was proposed, about 10 years ago, a block here next to Discovery. So if we look at that, what's happened to that subsequently is that yes, the block plan exists, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blocks that notionally extend the block plan of the city, and along comes the V&A as an outcrop, and you know when the competition was won and so on, that it was a building that sat out sat out with the water. And what that helped do was, A, it helped to mark the V&A as a rather special building, but it also helped to reinforce the rigour, if you like, of the block plan. But what happens is that changes. I do that. And you can see that the V&A, for all sorts of good reasons, has actually now moved inland. It's going to cost £11 million just to build the underbuilding out into the water that supported the V&A. And all that underbuilding will be seen by nobody, and it's public money. The V&A is being built by public money, so it's your money, and my money, my parents' money. £11 million of it under the water with nothing to show. So I think for good reason it's been brought in. And in this drawing they try to sort of pretend that it belongs to part of the block plan. But actually you can see when you look at the ground floor plan of the V&A, it really has nothing to do with a block plan. So it calls into question all sorts of relationships all of a sudden. Because what you see is a thing that was a rather robust block plan has now got this building pushed into it, and it begins to sort of fragment and make this less coherent and clear, I think. So it's something that students have been working on, is looking at that and looking to see how we address these changes. I mean, that's the important thing to know about master plans. Anytime an architect or planner or any visionary has a plan, A, it's going to last a hell of a long time, and B, the chances of it being completed the way it was begun or imagined are extremely unlikely. So they need to be adaptable and flexible to change. So we're examining some of these things. So very quickly, that's really the sort of the period that John has spoken about. That's where it started. That's where we're at now, largely. And this is a seed that you'll all be familiar with. That's obviously this is now gone, and these are gone. This is going very quickly. You're all swimming in a new place. The casino is away. And this is the field here, the territory that we're interested in. And what we're interested in as architects is not simply always producing signature buildings. Architects have a much broader responsibility than that. And what we're looking at the group of students over the last 2 years, I mean, if we consider this is the Royal Arch, some of you may be aware that that's what used to exist. I actually have a video of somebody back kicking this into Phil, one of the docks, actually, to build the reclaimed land. They're actually kicking it physically into the river. It's amazing. So if that's our discovery and that's our V&A, let's imagine we're actually interested in this in the background. We're interested in the tissue of the city, what makes up the city, the kind of things that responsible architecture should do. So moving on, here are the things that we need to incorporate in the waterfront. And we need to incorporate a brief that consists of leisure facilities, residential facilities, and commercial facilities, broadly split a third, a third, a third. We obviously have this rather wonderful building that's coming by 2016 to accommodate, and it's all part of a much wider strategy. If the central waterfront sits in here, it's part of a much wider strategy to regenerate the whole of the edge of the Tay. So this is the city's vision. And I mean, I take it that this is an early, I understand that this is an early diagram, but it's a rather frightful. I think, I mean, I would sort of term this retail park urbanism. It has a certain, I can see the next sign and the Bata shoes, and you can just sort of read it. It's paper thin, and it's basically trying to address and confront how this large public space will operate. But one of the things that it does suggest is it does suggest the city are interested in buildings which differentiate themselves from one another, so that each little piece of the street is differentiated. There isn't the certain singularity that you see in the new town, but also not the same singularity of materials and consistency of fenestration and windows and openings and so on that I would argue you see in much of Dundee. So this is rather anomalous, but it does express a certain position. And this is supposed to be our front garden, our Dundee's front lawn. And I'll show you a little bit about what the intention for this is in a minute. So in order to study, I mean, this is a primary idea in the new master plan for the city, this great public space. So what we thought we'd do is have a look at other public spaces that function like that. And this is Trieste in Italy, which if you look, that's Dundee here, and there's the space, and this is Trieste. And they're broadly the same size, actually. That little grey area there's Dundee, that little grey area is Trieste. It also has a major road running in front of it and water at one end. So they're broadly the same space, the same size. The city want to use these for concerts and events and so on, and they reckon they can get about 10,000 people coming to a musical event. So the city see this as a civic space, but a revenue earning space as well. This is Portugal, same sort of scale of space. Again, you can see that it is plonked onto Dundee, so it's about the same sort of scale. So we look at that. Here's Dundee. Now, that's the back of the Caird Hall up here. So that's Dock Street. This is the space here. And then they have this space at the front. And I don't know if any of you know what's proposed here, but it's an urban beach. So this is Paris. This is what once a year in Paris they tip sand onto the Seine, and they actually use it as a rather marvellous place. So if any of you can imagine being in Dundee and sitting out there with all the Dundee populace getting around and actually bathing, then I think that's quite a bold vision. So we've basically looked at that and said, well, what was interesting about the city's proposal? When the space was proposed here, we've built this rather wonderful model to explore it that the students built last year. When the city was proposed here, the V&A didn't exist, the new railway station didn't exist, and behind that in here is the revamped Tay Hotel, which is now going to be Malmaison. So if you take these three significant projects, you begin to wonder about the validity of this large public space here, and you can ask questions about where it should go. Should the space actually, should we build in that space, and should the space just be the waterfront? Is one example. And another example is this, which I think is interesting, is that if we accept that this is the new gateway to the city, the V&A sits here with Discovery, Malmaison is a significant public building here, should the public space be moved? Should it gravitate? So if we do that, we can see that we can have fun exploring and animating where we put the public space as a major idea. So moving on, that's a diagram of what the public space would look like if it were located here, Malmaison, the railway station, and so on. So we think there's validity in this idea, but unfortunately we're too far behind the curve and the city are moving too quickly. So we have to address that, and we have to deal with it and actually move on and decide what we're going to do about it. These are two other things that students do, is that they don't just look at things visually, they actually analyse them to say, well, what's the footfall, where are the desire lines? We can study these in relation to tourist board figures and so on. And we can measure the commercial retail area for each master plan. So we looked at one, which was the big civic space in front of the V&A and the railway station, and we looked at the city's proposal. And actually in commercial terms, the city's proposal is actually better. So that does give them a plus point. Then we look at the infrastructure, we look at boulevards. For instance, they call the two big main streets that confront the water and the public space, they call them boulevards. Well, what a Dundee boulevard might be like. So we look at Paris, we look at Barcelona, we look at other cities and get students to understand the scale and nature of boulevards. We look at the urban blocks. We look at Edinburgh, the New Town, areas in Barcelona and Glasgow, and other areas. That's Dundee by comparison, so that's the scale. There's Dundee there, there's the railway station, V&A. That's the urban block scale proposed for Dundee. You can see it in relation, these are all to the same scale. That's Glasgow. And the interesting thing you see about Glasgow is immediately much denser, and so much higher. These buildings have varying heights, so they get light in once they get above a certain height. Whereas this rather bland, you might say, uniformity presents a building which, this is interesting because it has a back. It has a front around the main street, and it has a back which forms lanes. With Dundee, the proposal is all frontage, and that's a rather curious thing. So if we think about the streets that are being extended down to the water, what are they like? Well, they're not so hugely differentiated. If you go to Reform Street, I mean, high school people will be up and down here all the time, there's your McDonald's. And you have basically a largely undifferentiated street. Broadly the same materials and broadly the same fenestration, window openings and so on. The thing that you really notice is the differentiation at ground floor. That's where you really notice it. So what we've done is we've drawn all these. There's Caird Square, there's the back of the Caird Hall, there's Malmaison, and there's Union Street, Whitehall Street, and North Castle Street, all the streets that lead down to this new master plan that's going to occupy this space, the space here. So we look at the nature of streets quite closely as architects, we understand the existing buildings, but we also look at the special buildings and how the special buildings occupy the street, the things that you probably don't notice on a day-to-day basis. So we've drawn all these, the ones that have a significance as they lead down to the waterfront. There's the Tay Hotel. And we look at the brief, and we analyse the brief in relation to other cities. So there's Dundee City Council's. So we have residential and commercial and leisure made up by all these elements, and they're broadly the same size. So broadly the same size. If you look at other areas that have developed recently, they have much bigger components of residential, and that tells you something about the kind of community that they want to make down there. Because this will be a new community. So how you push and pull these relationships in terms of occupancy and use is quite key in determining what sort of community you make down there, and also what sort of revenue it returns for the city. So we can do simple things like we can take known parts of Scotland, like Glasgow, for instance. If we take Glasgow, the square in Glasgow is broadly, George Square is broadly the same size as the public square that's proposed in Dundee. So if we pack a bit of Glasgow onto the site, and we actually take the scale of Glasgow and look at it in relation to the scale of Dundee, what it does is, to the brief that we've been asked to come up with, is it amplifies it massively. It's far too much overdevelopment for the city of Dundee for its scale. So if you take the brief for Dundee, it shrinks and flattens down quite dramatically. So you get this rather pancake sort of development. So if we go back to that drawing, and we start to think about it, there's Dock Street, there's Malmaison, there's the back of the Caird Hall. We actually start to think about what kind of new architecture do we make down here that is going to differentiate in the way that the city have shown with these rather crude yellow, red and green buildings and things. How do we actually achieve that? Well, we can do certain things. If we take a line across here and imagine that's a kind of fold, that line becomes a fold. We can do something like we can say, right, there's that line there. Here's the grain of the existing city. Here is where all the buildings, the individual buildings are differentiated with the party walls and the cross walls. We can do a very simple thing, like we can fold that piece of the city onto that piece of the city. So if you look closely, that becomes that node that rationalised into a block. That piece there is that street there. That street there is this street here. So we actually map on, and there's actually Caird Hall down here, just folded onto the site. So we actually map on the existing grain of the city and flip it down onto the new part of the city, and it immediately begins to make a connection back between one to the other. So you can imagine the continuity of streets becomes more integrated, if you like. That's rationalised a little bit more with the V&A in place and the new railway station. So that gives us clues in terms of how we might actually start to parcel up the land and break up the city. And we can explore that in much more detail as students of architecture. We look at existing buildings along elevations and how to break them up, and actually start to explore how we might elevate and control these things. And John was talking about the use of stone and things to build the city. What's very interesting is that if you try to do that nowadays, it's much more complicated. I mean, then we could build with really thick stone, that's what we used to build the city, but now it's a very, very expensive material, and there are very few local quarries actually in operation. One at Denford, which is in operation at the moment, I'm using myself at the moment. It's a very difficult stone to use in a civic way. You could use it to build like this in compression with sort of random rubble or snack rubble, but actually to build it in a way that you would imagine civic buildings being made, when you try and dress it, it becomes pretty untidy. And the sort of joints that you need in relation to the size of the stone and everything is really rather crude. So it's not that it's an automatic assumption you might think, let's build a local stone. It's actually more complex in the modern age to do it, mainly through cost and availability and the type of stone that we have in quarries that are open than you might think. So students would examine in great detail how you would build, as architecture students, how you might build. So you go from the range of the city to literally the door handle or the windowsill as an architecture student. And we look at how you deal with corners, how you deal with special buildings and streets, but all using one material. The interesting thing is the city are going to retain control of all the ground floor of the new master plan. So that's great, because that allows them to squeeze and push the rents and adjust things so that we can introduce variation and variety. So the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, we might be able to do that by manipulating the rentals. And that degree of control should then run through so that the ground floors begin to become controlled. And if we're going to use a material like stone, for example, that might be where we use it. What happens above might be a little free. So we can do that, we can study that. So we look at the various corner conditions in Dundee, we build little models of them. I think there are some models out in the hall that you can see. Dundee has some rather curious ones. It has little turrets, it has sort of cut-off turrets, but it also has these little inverted corners, which are quite interesting. And then we can apply these to streets and look and see how they actually work. So this is Dock Street again, and that looks at a little rounded corner. So we look at the new piece of the master plan, which is always on the right of the slide as we go, and we can look at towers or inverted corners, square corners, chamfered corners. But another aspect of urbanism that we're interested in Dundee isn't all fronts, and the master plan that's proposed does show all fronts. You'll probably be aware that Dundee has a fantastic series of vennels and so on that make up the secondary back parts of the city. And we've studied these in great detail. This is Peter Street, as you're probably aware. And we look and see how you can actually build in a modern day this really close proximity that engenders another kind of civic life. And you get all these rather rich and wonderful relationships that come as a result of that. So these are the 60-odd vennels that we've looked at. We've studied them in great detail. We've looked at all the criteria that make them nice and interesting. And that might suggest a different kind of urban pattern. This is a piece of the Seagate from here, dropped into the site and then cut with streets that might make sense of the railway station. So that enriches a new type of urbanism that might just give more variety and variation, which is actually where I began, what the city might actually be after, but it would be doing it with more integrity. And at that point, I shall hand over to Deborah.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a particularly warm welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. But I'd also like to say hello to the students. It's really fantastic also to see you here, and I hope you'll stay afterwards and speak to our visitors. 100 years ago or more, Patrick Geddes might have been standing somewhere near here. He was a professor of botany at the University of Dundee, but most of us in planning would actually know of him as the father of town and regional planning. In fact, he invented the term Connervation, and he had some really exciting ways, I think, of how we can explore thinking about the city and the city region. And he said that really what makes a city or a city region successful is that you have to think about the place, the work, and the folk. We might recognise that today in the school curriculum around the environment, the economy, and society, sustainability. So I want, in my talk about town and regional planning, really to draw a little on some of Patrick Geddes' ideas. Now, John gave us a fantastic lecture on the geology and the geography, and planners, of course, are influenced by the past. But I want to take us up to the Scottish level, to the level of the vision that the Scottish Government has for Scotland as a whole, and think about what that actually means for Dundee as a city. And this is the National Planning Framework. This is the spatial vision for Scotland for the next 20, 30 years. Actually, it's version number 3. And Scotland wants to have, or see the nation as a successful, sustainable place, as a low-carbon place, as a connected place and a natural place to invest. And I think it'd be really interesting to think about how Dundee fits into that bigger picture. And one of the things that planners do is engage with people. Participation is a really core part of how we try to develop visions for the future. And the Scottish Government, when it was developing its National Planning Framework, let's call it the NPF, when it was developing that, it actually engaged with young people. I don't know whether you would actually agree with what these 500 young people about your age said about where they saw Scotland go, but I was intrigued that it was about creating places that improve health and well-being, provide for better quality towns and cities, and also about protecting our natural environment. Those were the 3 top ideas that young people thought would make Scotland a better place. And young people were also asked some open-ended questions, and I was struck by this: it's not all about leisure, it's all about beauty. If more of our towns and cities are more appealing, we will appreciate Scotland so much more. I thought that was actually very powerful. Now, Graham talked to us about the waterfront. He talked to us about the master plan, so a different scale. And I was very interested to note that in the NPF, in the National Planning Framework for Scotland, the Dundee waterfront is actually identified as of national importance. What we are doing here in Dundee is of national importance. The NPF specifically says that what we are doing here is transformational for Scotland. That's very exciting. So what does that mean? It means in the future that we as planners, Louise, Lucy, we have to be thinking about making sure that that development is of high quality and well designed, that it actually speaks to a sense of place, that we promote health and well-being, and that we make sure Dundee is distinctive, drawing on the ideas that Graham was talking about. How do we build on the past? How do we make it very much Dundee distinctive? Now, we don't just operate with a master plan of the waterfront. The Dundee City Council also has to think about the wider workings of the city. As Graham was saying, he was saying, what do we do for the commercial, residential, for example, aspects of the city? How do we manage the open space? So we also have a local development plan that actually sets out a vision for the future about how we're going to bring workplace folk, for example, together. So we have to balance the different uses. And I want then to return to Patrick Geddes, because Patrick Geddes also had an idea, a theory to help us plan the city region. And he, because he was working here, he actually developed something called the Tay Valley Section. He said, well, actually, you can't just think about cities on their own. You have to position them, as John was saying, within the city region. So we have to understand that actually the city needs to be conscious of all the activities that are going around about it. So the town and country planning dimension comes before. And interestingly, today, we now have a vision that takes account of the strategic city region forward planning, and that's called the Tay Plan. And interestingly, that brings together Dundee City Council with Angus, with Perth and Kinross, and also North Fife. So it's bringing us to another scale again. And that means that we can then be, when we're thinking about town and country planning, we can then be alert to issues, for example, of biodiversity. We can be thinking about food security. And John has explained how the geology and the geography of this place makes all of this feasible. And we need to respect that and think, well, where does development go? And what sort of land do we protect and conserve for other uses? Because we're not always very respectful of our land. Land is a fixed, finite future resource, and so we have a huge responsibility to think about how we are going to plan our city and our city region. We've seen over the news, over the last couple of days, the impact of coastal erosion robs shrinking land, and see the dramatic effects that sea level rise and such surges can do to people's lives and people's livelihoods. So what does it mean? How could Dundee contribute to the vision of the Scottish Government and the National Planning Framework? What would it mean if Dundee became a low carbon place? Well, we have to make sure that all of the buildings and development that we have is energy efficient. Maybe we want to promote the city to have an alternative business profile and promote green energy. Does the university have to invest more in its research and development? What does that mean for the type of buildings and facilities that we need to attract that type of investment into the city? And if you look at the National Planning Framework, it indicates that actually offshore there is a potential for renewable energy forms, and that's going to have particular implications for how we imagine the relationship between the land, the terrestrial, and the marine. Again, you might have seen in the news, this is also topical. Do we erect these wind turbines on land, in rural areas, or in urban areas? Or do we, as this photo montage of a proposed marine energy wind farm off the Fife coast, and if you could just make out what the wind turbines might look like, do we actually put these facilities out in the marine environment? And this cuts really to the core of some of the really difficult issues that planners have to address, because we have to balance, mediate between these competing users and these competing interests. So do we try to promote different ways of working that might attract different investment into the city, or how do we look after our nature? So we have to think very carefully about how we actually manage and promote development. If we're thinking about Dundee into the future as a connected place, we might think simplistically that that might just be about the roads and the bridges. But it isn't. We have to think about digital connectivity, we have to think about broadband. Perhaps you have a vision of the city that's much more about healthy travel. Maybe it's about walking and cycling. Just again, as we see in the news that Dundee Airport might be closing, what does that mean if we're trying to attract more international visitors to the city? You know, what do we need to do about the airport? We're focusing on the waterfront today. If we think about the seaport, what does that mean for the type of sea vessel that we might be wishing to attract to the city? Is it going to be about more freight so that we can get freight off the roads? Do we want to emphasise marina and leisure facilities? Do we want cruise ships, more cruise ships, bigger cruise ships? How do we manage the population? Now, John really started with this, about the natural context of Scotland, and the Scottish Government wished to see Dundee and other cities in Scotland as natural places to invest. And we've seen how very much Dundee has that fantastic setting to attract new types of businesses. It's fantastic that the V&A has chosen to come here. We have attracted Malmaison. Now this is an international chain of huge repute. It has made the decision to invest here because it sees this city as a fantastic place with a wonderful natural setting. So we have to think, well, what sort of other activities do we need to stimulate within the city around leisure and recreation? What about the knowledge economy and studying here? What about culture and tourism? All of these activities have to have buildings and facilities to support them, and planners need to make decisions about what type of development it is and where it goes. The right development at the right place at the right time. Last year, interestingly, in Amsterdam, they opened the Eye film focus. In Northern Ireland, again last year, they opened Titanic Belfast. Both cultural facilities. It's actually 40 years ago this year that Sydney Opera House was opened in Sydney. And as you can see, these are cities that are using their waterfronts in quite inspirational ways. And I was really interested, because I was lucky enough to go to Sydney, but I was really interested that people visiting that city now, 40 years on, are so proud about that place. We are so blessed to have such a quality venue situated in one of the most picturesque settings in the world. And don't you think that actually we have one of the most picturesque settings in the world as well? And that in a few years' time, people will be looking back and they'll be saying, actually, and what about Dundee? So I think we have to be really proud of the Dundee Partnership, which brings together the City Council, with the businesses and the major stakeholders in the city, like the universities, that they are really pushing to transform the city and to develop the city in new ways. If we were businesses, we would be talking about location, 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 as being the place where we really wanted to work and enjoy our leisure. So we've looked in a number of different ways this afternoon, from the block plan to the master plan, to the local plan, to the strategic plan, and also the national planning framework, that Dundee really has a very important part to play, not only in the future of Scotland, but perhaps also looking further afield. The Dean didn't actually say this, but this is actually the first School of the Environment winter lecture. It's the first time that geography and architecture and planning have really come together to share the different ways that the different disciplines come together, how they fit together. And I hope you really get a sense that actually we have to work together. It is incredibly interdisciplinary within the school. Now, we decided also not to put you on the spot and ask you if you have any specific questions, but we've tried to tell you a lot about us. We've tried to tell you a lot about our passion for the city And so what we would like to do now is really to invite you outside. You probably saw that there are some stands outside. I think there might be the old mince pie, but we would really encourage you to join us outside. We wish you a very Merry Christmas, but do come and join us, and we'll share a little orange juice together. Thank you very much.